What's good, everyone? Welcome back to The Forge. Today we're diving into a heavy conversation between Andrew Huberman and Anna Lembke. But before we jump into this, I need you to do me a favor. Drop any biases you might have. Whether you're a hardline atheist, a spirituality junkie, or someone who's just been burned by religion, put it in a box for a few minutes. I want you to watch this with an open mind and look for the patterns. Look for the overlap between the lab and the altar. These two are absolute titans in neuroscience, and they're mapping out the biology of addiction. Why your brain feels like a maze you can't escape. But here's the reality check. What they're discovering in high-tech labs today, the ancient church fathers mapped out in the desert thousands of years ago. Neuroscience calls it dopamine reward circuits. St. Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas called it the passions and a state of disordered desire. It's the same shit, different day. And most dudes are stuck. They're locked in a materialistic mindset, thinking addiction is just a lack of willpower, a moral fail, or some chemical imbalance they're a victim of. That's a half-truth that keeps you a slave. Addiction is a mechanism. It's a spiritual parasite using your biology against you. And I'm here to help you map that reality. We're using the science as the hardware and orthodox theology as the software. If you want to navigate this minefield, you're going to need both. So let's get into it.
What is dopamine? And what are maybe some things about dopamine that most people don't know, and probably that I don't know either?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are those molecules that bridge the gap between two neurons. So they essentially allow one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. Dopamine is intimately associated with the experience of reward, but also with movement, which I think is really interesting because movement and reward are linked, right? If you think about, early humans, you had to move in order to go seek out the water or the meat or whatever it was. So dopamine is this really powerful, important molecule in the brain that helps us experience pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, but it's a really, really important one.
Did you catch that? Dopamine isn't just feeling good. It's movement. It's the engine that drives the hunt. The fathers called this Epitheia, the desiring power of the soul. It's meant to move us toward God, toward life. But when we're in addiction, that engine is redlining 24/7. In my old life, I was always moving, always chasing. I thought I was free because I was doing what I wanted. But I was just an NPC following a chemical carrot on a stick. When you starve a passion, it doesn't just go away. It fights back. In my agnostic days, I couldn't hack this. I think, why not use? The world sucks anyways. Might as well use and feel good for 10 minutes. It's the only way I'll feel alive. That's the nihilism talking. And conversely, I try to manage it, scheming to skip days to avoid dependence. It never works because it never works trying to negotiate with a hunger that is fundamentally infinite. The difference now? Meaning. When you understand that this hunger is actually meant for the infinite, for Christ, for truth, you realize your desire isn't bad. It's just misdirected. You aren't just getting sober. You're undergoing catharsis, purification. You have to embrace the suck of the hunt to get to the resurrection. Like Viktor Frankl said, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Let's keep going.
And if you want to think about something that most people don't know about dopamine, which I think is really interesting, is that we are always releasing dopamine at a kind of tonic baseline rate. And it's really the deviation from that baseline rather than like hits of dopamine in a vacuum that make a difference. So when we experience pleasure, our dopamine release goes above baseline. And likewise, dopamine can go below that tonic baseline. And then we experience a kind of pain.
And she's dead on with the biology. But here's the red pill truth. You are not just a bag of chemicals. You have a baseline, yes, but you also have a will. This deficit state she's talking about, that dip into pain, that's the itch, where the battle is won or lost. St. Paul hits this 2,000 years ago in Romans 7:15. I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep doing. Have you ever heard someone say, I want to quit? Before Christ, I was a slave to that dip. When the high dissipated, I moved. Period. But real freedom, Christian liberty, isn't the power to do whatever you want. It's the power to not do what your broken impulses tell you to do. You can master those thoughts before they become actions. You don't have to be a slave to the molecule. The Fathers laid out exactly how these deficit thoughts take hold of us. It's a process, and if you know the steps, you can stop the crash. Number 1 is provocation, the knock. A thought image pops up, a memory of the high, a little feeling, a grievance, a temptation. It's not a sin yet, it's just an assault. And then the coupling, the chat. You start talking to it, you entertain it. Well, maybe just one, I've had a hard week. And then the assent, the yes. Your heart says, okay. And then this is where the inner man falls before the act even happens. We know this through relapse, right? People will say, you can tell he's going to relapse far before it even happens, right? And then there's the captivity, the pull. The thought gains momentum. Now it's sticky. You feel like you're being dragged. And the passion, the habit, it becomes a second nature. The baseline is now controlled by the habit. And then the act, the inner consent becomes the outward behavior. The goal isn't just to fix the baseline. It's to transform the will so you aren't just white-knuckling it, but actually becoming a new man who doesn't need the spike to feel whole. You actually start wanting different things. All right, let's keep going.
Some interesting findings. First, you see that people who are more impulsive, who have a thought to do something and just do it impulsively, are people who are more vulnerable to addiction. What we now conceptualize in our current ecosystem as mental illness are actually traits that in another ecosystem might be very advantageous. They're just not advantageous right now. And we have to constantly check ourselves. And so impulsivity is something that right now can be a difficult trait, but isn't in and of itself a bad thing.
In a previous conversation we had, you said something that really rung in my mind, which is that many people who become addicted to things have this feeling that normal life isn't interesting enough. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your experience with this association, if it really exists, between people's sense of the normalcy or maybe even how boring life can be and their tendency to become addicts of some sort.
I think that life for humans has always been hard, but I think that now it's harder in unprecedented ways. And I think that the way that life is really hard now is that it actually is really boring. All of our survival needs are met. We don't even have to leave our homes to meet every single physical need.
Traits that were advantageous in another ecosystem. She's saying we are built for a different world, which seems to be a recurring pattern, as you will see. I believe this is because our souls and psyches were meant to be fueled by the Logos, by God himself, drawing from our very existence and cooperation. That impulsivity she talks about, in the wild, that was survival. That was hunting. That was war. But in this soft climate-controlled box we live in, the energy has nowhere to go. So that energy gets pointed inward, at ourselves as we slowly end our existence, or outward as we sever bonds by betraying and stealing and lying to those we love. This is exactly what the Greek word for sin means. Hamartia. It literally means missing the mark. It's not that your energy is bad, it's that it's misdirected. We are hunters living in a zoo, trying to feed an infinite hunger with finite things. Porn, scrolling, drugs. That boredom she mentions isn't boredom. It's your soul screaming that something is wrong, that this can't be all there is. Let's see what else she has to say.
as long as you're of a certain level of financial well-being, which frankly, we talk so much about, the income gap, and certainly there is this enormous gap between rich and poor, but that gap is smaller than it's ever been in like the history of humans. We don't really have anything that we have to do. So we're all forced to make stuff up, whether it's being a scientist or being a doctor or being an Olympic athlete or, climbing Mount Everest. And people really vary in their need for friction. And some people need a lot more than others. And if they don't have it, they're really, really unhappy. And I do think that a lot of the people that I see with addiction and other forms of mental illness are people who need more friction. Like they're unhappy, not necessarily because there's something wrong with their brain, but because their brain is not suited to this world.
Aha. Their brain is not suited to this world. Let that sink in. Traits suited for another ecosystem. This hits hard because we live in a padded cell of safety, a created world of comfort that has become so ingrained in our psyches that we forget this isn't reality. For men specifically, this is lethal. We were forged for friction, for the fire. But now, between government welfare, safe spaces, and comfort culture, we don't have to do anything to survive. So what happens? We create our own friction. We self-sabotage. We create chaos just to feel something real. We create socially constructed realities that we are then forced to navigate. We create images of ourselves in our minds that reality does not line up with. When I was running and drugging, most people would think I was a really decent person if we sat down and they got to know me. I even thought I was a good person. I thought I was the noble rebel fighting the system of oppression. But does a good person do bad things? Does a good person lie, cheat, steal, manipulate? If a good person doesn't do those things, then we need to reevaluate that self-image. Essentially, this is an inversion of the good. We drown in distractions, screens, sugar, booze. On one hand, trying to silence the call to adventure. On the other hand, we are drowning out the voice of our own conscience, our shame. Nobody is exempt from this, rich or poor. If you don't have a battle to fight, you'll turn the sword on yourself or you'll turn it on your neighbor. And the thing is, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword.
Yeah. So to me, one of the most significant findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, which means the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And they work like a balance. So when we feel pleasure, our balance tips one way. When we feel pain, it tips in the opposite direction. And one of the overriding rules governing this balance is that it wants to stay level. So it doesn't want to remain tipped very long to pleasure or to pain. And with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what scientists call homeostasis.
This is the law of equivalent exchange. You can't cheat physics and you can't cheat the soul. You tip that scale toward pleasure with Molly, Coke, booze, opiates, and the pendulum must swing back. You have that crazy, speedy night, and the next day you feel like absolute death. And what do most of us do? The hair of the dog. We just do more and more as we try to tip the scale back up to avoid the pain, which turns it into a perpetual cycle of what we know as chasing the dragon. That's how the chains lock, and then that dragon becomes a Hydra. You cut off one head and two grow back. And you see this when guys quit opiates or something and then they move to another drug. They move to weed, booze, or become workaholics. Every time you try to cheat the balance, the collar gets tighter around your neck. You're mechanizing your own slavery. Wake up.
The way to combat that is to do it more, right? And more and more and more. So I think that is really what I want people to tune into and get an awareness around, because once you tune into it, you can see it a lot. And if you keep the model of the balance in mind, I think it gives people kind of a way to imagine what they're experiencing on a neurobiological level and understand it. And in that understanding, get some mastery over it.
This is huge, and it goes into free will. You cannot change a behavior you are not aware of. It's like that guy in your crew who constantly interrupts people. He has no clue he's doing it until you finally check him. He's living in a delusion where he's not doing anything wrong. It's all about him. He's not even aware. Once you shatter that delusion, he has a choice. The Orthodox call this Nepsis, watchfulness. It's being a guard at the gate of your own mind. If you're asleep at the wheel, the enemy walks right in. You have to watch your thoughts like you watched the street, like you watch your phone. Everything is connected. Environment, mind, body, spirit. You catch the thought before it even becomes an action, and that's how you win.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, when we find something that we enjoy that feels pleasurable, social media, food,
Right.
sex, gambling, whatever happens to be, there's some dopamine release when we engage in that behavior. And then what you're telling me is that very quickly,
Yes.
and beneath my conscious awareness, there's a tilting back of this scale where pleasure is reduced by way of increasing pain.
Right.
And I've heard you say before that the pain mechanism has some competitive advantages over the pleasure mechanism, such that it doesn't just bring the scale back to level, it actually brings pain higher than pleasure.
What happens right after I do something that is really pleasurable and releases a lot of dopamine is, again, my brain is going to immediately compensate by down-regulating my own dopamine receptors, my own dopamine transmission to compensate for that, okay? And that's that come down or the hangover or that after effect, that moment of wanting to do it more. Now, if I just wait for that feeling to pass, then my dopamine will re-regulate itself and I'll go back to whatever my chronic baseline is. But if I don't wait, and here's really the key, if I keep indulging again and again and again, ultimately, I have so much on the pain side, right, that I've essentially reset my brain to what we call like an anhedonic or lacking in joy type of state, which is a dopamine deficit state. So that's really the way in which pain can become the main driver, is because I've indulged so much in these high reward behaviors or substances that my brain has had to compensate by way down regulating my own dopamine, such that even when I'm not doing that drug, I'm in a dopamine deficit state, which is akin to a clinical depression. I have anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and a lot of mental preoccupation with using again or getting the drug. So in general, what we want is some kind of flexibility in that balance and the ability to easily reassert homeostasis. We don't want to break our balance, which is possible if we overindulge for enough period of time and end up with a balance tipped to the side of pain, this dopamine deficit state we've been talking about. We want a flexible, resilient balance, right? Which can be sensitive to things going on in the environment, which can experience pleasure and approach, which can experience pain and recoil, right? This is all adaptive and healthy and necessary and good. We would never want a balance that doesn't tilt.
Right.
That would be a disaster.
Right.
We wouldn't be human. And we wouldn't want that. It would be really, really boring. On the other hand, what people in recovery from addiction talk about is, to some extent, having to learn to live with things being a little boring a lot of the time, right? So trying to avoid some of this intensity and thrill seeking and escapism that really is at the core of addictive tendencies.
So along those lines, I've heard you say that in order to reset the dopamine system, essentially in order to break an addictive pattern, 30 days of zero interaction with that substance, that person, etc.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah. And 30 days is, in my clinical experience, the average amount of time it takes for the brain to reset reward pathways, for dopamine transmission to regenerate itself. By depriving ourselves of this high dopamine, high reward substance or behavior, we allow our brains to regenerate its own dopamine for the balance to really equilibrate. And then we're in a place where we can sort of enjoy other things.
That dopamine deficit she's talking about, if you've ever been in the game, you know that buzzing anxiety, that feeling that you just aren't right unless you're high. Even having it in your possession made you feel better. In rehab, they used to tell us, addiction is in the parking lot doing push-ups while you're in the meeting. It's waiting. Even the best of us fall when we stop watching. We feel that pull because we're trying to run on fumes. We can combat this, but you have to be vigilant. You can't turn your back on the shadow. It's that itch. When you focus on not itching, you can sometimes will yourself out of scratching it. But the second you start getting distracted by something, you find yourself itching without even realizing it. And once you're itching, it feels too good to stop. Let's continue.
Why is it then that people will relapse, not just after getting fired from a job or their spouse leaving them, but when things are going really well? Is it this unconscious mechanism? Because I've seen this before, is they have a great win. I have a friend who's a really impressive creative. I don't want to reveal any more than that, but and relapsed upon getting another really terrific opportunity to create for the entire world. And I was like, how can that happen? But now I'm beginning to wonder, was it the dopamine associated with that win that opened the spigot on this dopamine system? Because it happened in a phase of a really great stretch of life.
Yeah. Triggers are things that make us want to go back to using our drug. And the key thing about triggers, whatever they are, is they also release a little bit of dopamine, right? So just thinking about whatever the trigger is that we associate with drug use, or just thinking about drug use, can already release this anticipatory dopamine, this little mini spike. But here's the part that I think is really fascinating. That mini spike is followed by a mini deficit state. So it goes up and then it doesn't go back down to baseline. It goes below baseline tonic levels. And that's craving, right? So that anticipation is immediately followed by wanting the drug. And it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation to go and get the drug. So many people talk about dopamine is not really about pleasure, but about wanting and about motivation. And so it is that deficit state that then drives the locomotion to get it.
And earlier, your description of dopamine being involved in the desire for more, giving the sense of reward, but also movement.
Right.
I have to assume that those things are braided together in our nervous system for the specific intention of when you feel something good, then you feel the pain, or maybe you don't notice it, and then the next thing you know, you're pursuing more of the thing that could deliver pleasure.
And I love the way you use the word braided together. That's beautiful. There are people for whom bad life experiences, loss, in any form, stress in many different forms, that's a trigger. But there are absolutely people for whom the trigger is things going well. And the things going well can be like the reward of the things going well, but very often what it is the removal of the hypervigilant state that's required to keep their use in check. So it's this sense of, I want to celebrate, or this reward happened, I want to put more reward on there. And it's really, really fascinating because when people come to that realization about themselves, that they're most vulnerable when things are going well, that's really a valuable insight, because then they can put some, things in place or barriers in place or go to more meetings or whatever it is that they do, to protect themselves.
What Dr. Lembke is breaking down here is the physiological trap of the high life. We always think we're most at risk when we're in the dirt, but the red pill truth is that success is a trigger. That dopamine spike from a big win isn't just a feel-good moment. It's a physiological open door that drops you right into a deficit. Your brain starts screaming for reward to match the peak. And because our receivers are fried from years of chasing ghosts, we don't know how to celebrate with a steak or a prayer. We only know how to celebrate with a hit. This is the pride before the fall mechanic in real time. We stop being hypervigilant because the ego inflates. We start worshiping our own success. We look at the drug, the drink, or the vice as our peace and joy because we've forgotten how to find peace in the present. We aren't even living in the now anymore. We're just chasing the next spike to escape the inevitable dip. When you're in that cycle, you're not pursuing life. You're a slave to a chemical master. The only way out of that deficit state isn't more dopamine. It's grounding yourself in something that doesn't fluctuate with a bank account or a dopamine curve. The unchanging truth. You have to learn to be a king who still remembers he's a beggar, or your own success will become the very thing that buries you.
I wanted to just touch on something that you mentioned, which is the shame.
Yeah.
I heard you say in an interview with somebody else recently that truth-telling and secrets are sort of at the core of recovery. And tell us more about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really fascinating about working with people in recovery was how telling the truth, even about the merest detail of their lives, was central to their recovery. It's not even just not lying about using drugs. I have to not lie about anything. I can't lie about why I was late to work this morning, which we all do. Oh, I hit traffic. No, I didn't hit traffic. I wanted to spend 2 more minutes reading the paper and drinking my coffee, right? So people with addiction will get into, the lying habit where they're lying about random stuff because they're sort of in the habit of lying. And how recovery is really about telling the truth. And there's really interesting neuroscience behind it that suggests that when we tell the truth, drugs, we actually potentially strengthen our prefrontal cortical circuits and their connections to our limbic brain and our reward brain. And of course, these are the circuits that get disconnected when we're in our addiction, right? Our balance in our reward pathway or limbic brain, our emotion brain is doing one thing, and our cortical circuits are completely disengaged from that, ignoring what's happening, which is easy to do because it's reflexive. We don't need to think about that balance for the balance to be happening. But we have to re-engage those circuits, anticipate future consequences, think through the drink, not just how am I going to feel now if I use, but how am I going to feel tomorrow or 6 months from now? And that telling the truth is in fact a way to do that, to make these connections stronger. And I talk about some studies in my book that kind of indirectly show that.
I love that there's neuroscience being done on truth-telling and the value of truth-telling.
Yeah.
I hope they'll continue to do more work.
Yeah.
Lembke is hitting on a fundamental law of the universe. You cannot heal what you refuse to name. She's talking about prefrontal circuits, but I'm telling you about the soul. Addiction is built on a foundation of the lie. It's not just the big lies, like where the money went. It's the tiny, low-key lies we tell to protect our ego. When you lie about why you're late or how you're feeling, you're essentially keeping your brain in a state of fragmentation. Your conscious self and your acting self are living in two different worlds. And that split is exactly where the shame grows. Shame is like mold. It only survives in the dark. I used to drown in it because I was trying to forgive myself. But here's the truth. You can't forgive yourself. That's a modern myth that keeps people stuck. If you're the judge, the jury, and the defendant, then the trial is rigged. You'll either justify your bullshit or you'll minimize it, but you'll never be clean. True freedom only comes when you bring those secrets into the light, through confession and radical honesty. When you submit to the truth with a capital T, you're handing the keys of your life over to an objective reality. You stop fronting. You stop the Playboy performance. You look in the mirror, and yeah, it hurts like hell to see the wreckage. But the pain is actually your brain and soul reconnecting. That PFC circuit Lembke mentions, that's your noose, finally taking its rightful place as the driver of your life. The truth doesn't just make you feel better. It literally reintegrates your humanity. It's the only thing that cleans the lens so you can finally see home.
I want to ask you about using drugs to treat drug addiction. This is a vast area, right? Different chemistries for different drugs and different purposes. But the rationale, as I understand it, is take people who are in a pattern of addiction, launch them into a experience that's also chemical and extreme, often of the extreme serotonin and or extreme dopamine type. So MDMA,
Right.
ecstasy, for instance, tons of serotonin dumped, tons of dopamine dumped. How neurotoxic, if neurotoxic, debatable, et cetera, not the topic for now, but a lot. And then somehow that extreme experience wrapped inside of a supported network in there, whether or not there's just someone there or whether or not they're actively working through something with the patient, is supposed to eject the person into a life where drug use isn't as much of interest. This violates everything we've talked about in terms of dopamine biology. It would, if this arrangement is the way I described it, cause more addiction. It is anything but a dopamine fast. It's a dopamine feast. So we hear about successful transitions through this, at least anecdotally, and maybe some clinical study. What is going on? What is going on? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. So I think it's good that you're skeptical. I think we all should be skeptical. Having said that, there are clinical studies showing, and these are small studies and they're short duration, small number of subjects, but, taking people, for example, who are addicted to alcohol and then having them have this, let's say, psychedelic experience in a very controlled setting.
So typically it's a high dose psilocybin or 3-dose, as I saw it for the MAP study of MDMA, of
Right.
ecstasy. Those are sort of seem to be the kind of
typical,
bread and butter of this
Right.
kind of work.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing to really keep in mind is that this is completely interwoven with regular psychotherapy, and that these are highly selected individuals.
And
right?
clinical trials.
Right.
We're
And these are
referring to legal clinical
right,
trials.
Right. When it works, it's a transformational experience because it gives the person another lens through which to view their lives, which I think for some people is positive and powerful because they can come back from that and be like, oh my gosh, I care about my family and I want X, Y, or Z for them. And I realize that my continuing to drink is not going to, achieve that. So it's almost like a spiritual or values based. So I think it can be very powerful. But having said that, I truly am quite skeptical because addiction is a chronic relapsing and remitting problem. It's hard for me to imagine that there's something that works very quickly short term that's going to work for a disease that's really long lasting.
Yeah, the two addicts I know that did MDMA assisted psychotherapy as part of this thing both got worse.
Yeah.
But the people I know who had severe trauma, who took this approach, seemed to be doing better.
Okay, interesting.
And so I think that the discussion as we hear it now is just sort of psychedelics, which is a huge category that includes many different drugs and compounds with different effects. And we hear about trauma and addiction lumped together. And I think it's going to be important for people to know that this is definitely not a one size fits all kind of thing, but it sounds like it may have some utility under certain conditions.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm trying to be very open-minded about its potential utility for certain individuals, but I can tell you in my clinical work, what is a very concerning unintended consequence of this narrative is I have a lot of people who are looking for some kind of spiritual awakening who on their own, not in the context of any kind of therapeutic psychological work, microdose or want to try, psilocybin or MDMA with a friend or wherever so they can have this, spiritual experience that they can figure out their lives. That's a disaster and almost never works out well. And I can just tell you that the downstream effect for the average person is that they've misconstrued the data on the use of psychedelics for mental health conditions to this idea that they're safe or that anybody can take them in any circumstance and have this kind of awakening. And that's not what the data show, right? The data are these
medicalized miracle. The idea that you can solve a soul problem with a chemical eject button. She's skeptical because the math doesn't add up. You can't fix a chronic dopamine deficit by dumping a bucket of serotonin on it and hoping for the best. But let's look at the spiritual side of this. The word for sorcery or magic in the New Testament is Pharmakeia. It literally refers to the use of drugs to induce spiritual experiences. I've been there. I've taken the trips, met the entities, and felt the oneness, quote unquote. But here's the truth. An experience isn't a transformation. You can have a spiritual awakening on a Tuesday, but if you haven't done the work of repentance and discipline on Wednesday, you're just a high dude with a new set of stories and theories. These substances are a cheat code, but they are a code that cracks the whole game. They give you the view from the mountaintop without the climb of the mountain. And because you didn't earn the view through theosis, through actual struggle and union with God, with Logos, you have no idea how to stay there. You're trying to hack reality, but the soul doesn't have a back door. When you open those doors with chemicals, you aren't just letting light in. You're leaving yourself vulnerable to whatever is lurking in the hallway. I've seen it 1,000 times. The enlightenment fades, the dopamine crashes, and you're left even more hollow because you realize your breakthrough was just another high. Look, if you're using harm reduction, like Suboxone and Methadone to stop the bleeding so you don't end up in a pine box today, fine. Do what you have to do with a doctor. But don't confuse stabilizing your addiction with healing. Eventually, you have to face the shadow. You have to understand why you're doing this in the first place. You have to face Christ, truth. Real peace doesn't come from a tab or a needle. It comes from the grueling, daily work of carrying your cross, living for something outside yourself. You can't bypass the cross and expect to get to the resurrection. There are no shortcuts to becoming a whole man, a sovereign man. Look, we've covered a lot of ground today. From dopamine circuits and the pleasure-pain balance to the ancient wisdom of the church fathers and the trap of Pharmakeia. But at the end of the day, all this knowledge is just a map. A map is useless if you're too paralyzed to walk the path. We live in a world that wants you distracted, dopamine fried, and divided against yourself and your neighbor. It wants you to believe that you're just a mistake of biology or a victim of your past. But I'm telling you, as someone who's been in the trenches, I have lost 33 people to this war, and it climbs every year. I walked out of the graveyard, and there is a healer. Science can tell you why your brain is broken, but only Christ can tell you who you are meant to be. If you're tired of the itch, tired of the pink cloud that always ends in a crash, and tired of the lies you tell yourself in the dark, then stop trying to hack the system. Stop looking for a cheat code and start looking for the truth. If you're struggling or you know someone who is, I'm asking you to do something radical. Don't just go to another meeting where you talk in circles. Find a local Orthodox church. Walk in. It was hard. I did it myself. I didn't have anyone there. I was alone. But I'm telling you, don't worry about it. It's a lot at first. Don't worry about the incense or the icons or the weirdness of it all. Just be open. Show up with your wreckage and see what happens when you encounter a tradition that's been healing souls for 2,000 years. If you want truth, radical change, and a peace that actually stays when the high wears off, what do you have to lose? Your chains? Your shame, regret, your hollowed out life? Hit that subscribe button, share this with a brother who's struggling, and let's keep mapping this reality together. We're going deep into recovery, theology, and what it actually means to be a man in this modern maze. What does it mean to be human? Stay watchful, stay disciplined, and I'll see you in the next one.